Hello and welcome to our web chat on working capital management benchmarks, and we're going to be discussing how to understand them and use them. And we are joined by Brian Shanahan, CEO and founder of Intermeter, and he's a leader in the industry. He assists companies in the areas of working capital management and procurement, and he's worked in many countries and across 4 continents. Brian, the question that always occurs to me when I see these numbers, these survey numbers, is, are working capital benchmarks a waste of time?
Well, Jack, there's an argument that certainly a lot of people would agree with you with that statement. And I think the reason for that is they see many publications now where people are saying you can literally save trillions if we all manage working capital in a better way. I think the sad fact about this is that there's no doubt that people can certainly do better working capital management, and potentially there are billions on the table. But many of the surveys, I think, go to the point of exaggeration, and they don't necessarily explain exactly how they put the numbers together. So therefore, anyone who kind of understands this even a little bit will become a skeptic. Therefore, the point of doing the surveys in the first place almost negates itself.
Is it just the problem of only using publicly available information? What are some of the other problems?
Well, I think that the core point here, Jack, is that it is all about the limitations of public information. But I think also, now that this is becoming, well, it has become a global subject, the way different countries and companies display their information is different, simply because of the different regulations that exist, be it in the European Union, the United States, Japan, wherever it might be. So that you really need to look at all of these numbers and understand each component and what potentially could be wrong with it. Because if you don't understand those things, then you're going to come up with potentially huge numbers, which in a peer comparison, you're going to be very risky with in the long term, because it's going to be very difficult to deliver some of these huge numbers.
You say the numbers are wrong, but how wrong can they be? Where are the sources of error?
The numbers are not so much wrong as misleading. And let me give you a few examples. The first thing is on the revenue side. If we look at most accounting statements across the world, people report net revenue. So it's net of rebates, net of VAT. So if I give you an example of, say, a company in the United States where you don't have VAT versus a company in France where you do have VAT. So if they're reporting net revenue, that's a true statement, but that's not the value of money that has to be collected. Therefore, the DSO of the French company will look better than the US one, simply because it looks as if they have less to collect. Pardon me, the other way around. It looks as if it's worse because it looks as if they have less to collect. A second reason is rebates. And if I give you a specific example of the pharmaceutical industry, where the rebates that are paid in the United States in particular can literally amount to hundreds of millions of dollars per year. Now that means you have a huge difference between gross and net revenue, and nothing whatsoever to do with taxes at all. That's on the revenue side. If you look on the payable side, the problem there is that the purchases number, which is what you should be comparing trade payables with, i.e. third-party trade purchases, that's not something that people publish. So many organizations will either do the example on cost of goods sold or on revenue. Well, revenue is just wrong, because the number is just too high. But even cost of goods sold, if I give you an example of someone like G4S, for example, who would have most of their cost of goods sold is actually money paid in people's salaries and wages. And that's not a third-party purchase. And actually their level of third-party purchasing, because of the type of company they are, is very, very low. Now, if I then compare them with, say, Tyco, and their ADT business, that's a product business largely. So they do have lots of third-party purchases, which G4S would not have. Therefore, even though the numbers published might end up looking some way similar, these are actually not very similar comparisons at all. And that's the piece that needs to be understood.
Have you got any examples of the product mix or geographies can affect the numbers? Okay,
well, if we just talk about the inventory number, in calculation terms, this is probably the most accurate of the 3. But then if I compare 2 different companies, again, take a services company versus a manufacturing company. A services company might have, maintenance pieces in inventory where they don't have raw materials. But even 2 manufacturing companies It very much depends on the nature of the production line. So, for example, if I make gelatin, or beer, that takes weeks and weeks and weeks. If I make firewall, that takes 2 seconds, literally, in terms of the length of the production process. So, therefore, is it right that I compare the company making firewall with the company making beer in production terms? Probably not, because the issues they have or will have around managing inventories be quite different. And the second issue is around geography. So let's say I'm a German company where, average terms in Germany tend to be in the low 20s of days. Now, if I went to Japan, that's probably in the low 90s of days. Now, that's really down to the culture around how payment terms are done in these different countries. So if I compare the 90 days of Japan versus the 20-odd days of Germany, does that mean the Japanese at worst are collecting the Germans? Not really. It's different cultural norms going on. I could turn this one around on the supplier side to say, well, terms in Italy, for instance, tend to be much shorter than in Sweden. So again, just because the guy in Italy has got a much bigger payables balance than the guy in Sweden, does that mean he's better? No, it just means that the cultural norm is different. So and the next problem is that if we're talking about multinationals, they don't just have one product. They have multiple products. They don't just operate in one geography, they operate in multiple geographies. So all of this is getting mixed up all the time. So it's very difficult to compare really apples with apples.
So what is the single most important thing in working capital management benchmarks? How can we make sense of it and see what it matters to me, my company?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is I'm not trying to, totally rout the whole idea of working capital benchmarks, because they are good to use used in the right context. Now, what do I mean by that? Very often companies, and they should ask themselves continuously to say, could I be better at this particular subject? And very often a first and very simple step is to do one of these high-level benchmarks. Now, when you look at the answers to these, this is where it becomes important. All the benchmark can do is give you a guide as to whether there is some real value in this subject or not. That's all it can do. And hopefully the guide points you in the right direction. The next step should always be to do more detailed analysis to verify what the real numbers are. But of course, you don't really want to go into such a big exercise without having some kind of an indication that it was worth doing in the first place.
If my CFO is beating me up, because our working capital management numbers aren't the same as the rest of the industry, where do I start refuting this?
Well, I would say two things. One, you may do the simple high-level working capital benchmark, and that might support your argument. But if it doesn't, then you need to go into more detail. Now, there's two ways you can do that. You can do the full analysis and spend a lot of time and potentially, cost on this. Which you can do, but if you don't want to do that, the other alternative is go to termscheck.com, because that way you can actually compare suppliers and your customers directly with other customers and suppliers, and it's a different type of benchmark, but it's something that then phases out all these issues around mix and numbers and measurement and so on, that you can actually get a much more direct comparison. And be it you're operating defensively, or you're being a lot more progressive and actually looking for value, that would be my recommendation of how to do this correctly.
Thank you. I think understanding and putting working capital benchmarks in context is vital, because they're going to be around forever. And
the one thing I would say, Jack, is like all benchmarks, they may give you a reasonable comparison with peers, but they can never tell you how good you can be.
Yeah, that's a limitation of any benchmark, and that's where you come in as consultants, of course.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jack.